My name is Lauren Teal, and I am the Vice President of the American Constitution Society. We're an organization that promotes a progressive interpretation of the Constitution, and Matt is the president here, Matt Myers, and he or I or any ACS member, if you're a member, will you raise your hand? Would love to talk to you about joining the ACS in fuller fashion after this is over. So the reason we're here today is, Mr. Alan Jackson, and that is really his name.
And I had it first.
Can present on federal firearms laws. So he is a well-accomplished gentleman. He used to serve in the Air Force as the Assistant Staff Judge Advocate in the Area Defense Counsel in the JAG, as well as he then practiced in Tyler in a practice called Jackson & Jackson, which was 3 generations of Jackson. His son now operates that firm. And he then worked for the U.S. Air Force Reserve and is currently now an Assistant U.S. Attorney in the Eastern District of Texas and the Criminal Chief for the Eastern District of Texas. So he handles all of the criminal prosecutors in the area from Marshall to Tyler,
to Texarkana, to Beaumont.
To Plano, Texarkana. He received his JD from the University of Texas and
everybody.
And his BFA in political communications from SMU. He is married and has 2 children, Reeve and Ashley, and he also is super involved in his community. He's from Lindale, Texas, and I had the privilege of working with him last summer, and he's a great supervisor and mentor at the U.S. Attorney's Office. And with all of that, I now have the privilege to introduce to you Mr. Alan Jackson.
I do appreciate y'all letting me come. It's interesting to see what a law school looks like that wasn't built in the 30s. I'm blown away. I'm not happily blown away about it, but I am blown away. This is really nice. I appreciate y'all coming. I can't imagine why you are here today if tomorrow's a holiday. Why y'all are already off doing what I know you do when you're not in class. A couple of things before we get started. Number one, I swear that the UT tie and the SMU cufflinks are a coincidence. It never occurred to me, well, I put them on this morning, that I was coming to Baylor, so don't hold that against me. Number two, about 3 weeks ago, Lauren emailed me and said, hey, we're ready to publicize this, I need a title, have you got a title? So, no, I didn't. So, sort of shooting from the hip, within about 5 minutes, I shipped this off to her, never thinking, as a non-21st century person, that she would do things like post it on Facebook. So, as far as I know, Eric Holder does not know about my title yet. If you see him, I would appreciate it if you not share it with him, because I don't know whether he will share my passion for the quirkiness of federal firearms laws. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Talk a little bit about background, because I think you have to have some background to understand why some federal criminal laws are the way they are. And then talk about a couple of operations and how they affect where we are right now and what may be happening with respect to federal firearms laws in the future. And I got to thinking. I've been working on this, and the other day I was in Dallas and I got behind this car, and you know how all the minivans and the SUVs will have these cute little bumper stickers with daddy and mommy and little boy and little girl and dog and stick figures. I got behind one that said it had the word family, and then daddy was an AK-47, and mama looked like a 30-06, and son was a shotgun, and daughter was a rifle, and I think puppy was a cat pistol or something. I don't know. But I thought, that in a nutshell says how we in America feel about our firearms. They are as American as fried chicken. And so we have this tension, and it's reflected in the things we're going to talk about, between, on the one hand, we can't just turn everybody loose with AK-47s, and on the other hand, we have to respect the American tradition of possessing firearms. How many of y'all in here have at least one firearm? I've got two. I would have more if I weren't too cheap to buy them. And you know, we just do. And we like them, and we don't want anybody. But anyway, so that made me go home, and I ran an internet search for firearms bumper stickers. And I found them all over the map. And some really good ones. Some of the pro ones for firearms that I found. Gun in the hand is better than a cop on the phone. With guns, trucks, and beer, who needs women? And then from the other gender, a girl needs a gun like a boy needs a girl. And the one, I mean, this is quintessential East Texas. The Second Amendment ain't about duck hunting. But there are, in fact, some anti-firearm bumper stickers. And I will tell you, they are not nearly as fun as the pro-fire. I mean, I don't know whether the anti-folks have no sense of humor or they're just not creative. I don't know what it is, but you get things like, I'd rather not be shooting a gun. Or, imagine a future free from gun violence. Or, get rid of your illegal gun or go to jail. Period. And then I found my favorite one. And to be honest, I don't know which side of the aisle it is on, but it is exemplified by this picture. And it was, guns don't kill people, dads with pretty daughters do. And I thought, okay, that one I understand. And I will also, I hate to tell you this, but you have now seen the acme of my PowerPoint skills as far as it goes, because from here on out it's just stuff with writing on it. And I didn't know how to do this, but fortunately somebody in the office did. You got to start, if you want to talk about firearms, you got to start with the Constitution, because as we know, the federal government is a government of limited powers, and we derive all of our power from what the Constitution says the federal government can do. And the first one is Interstate Commerce Clause, which simply gives Congress the power to regulate commerce between nations and among the states, and on occasion with the Indian tribes. And the bottom line is, over however many years of Supreme Court jurisprudence, if the federal government can connect it to interstate commerce, we can probably criminalize it. And we're going to talk about some examples of that. It doesn't have to be much of a connection, but if we can get it to interstate commerce, we can criminalize it. Then we also have the taxing authority, which gives the United States government the authority to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and so forth. And that's another way that we can get to criminal jurisdiction. And then finally we have the Necessary and Proper Clause, which simply gives the federal government the authority to make laws necessary and proper to carrying out its authority under the Constitution. So we've got these wonderful constitutional provisions, and then on the other side we have constitutional provision. Oh, come on. I know you have a gun. I'm sorry?
Second Amendment.
Come on, say it loud and proud. Yeah, we've got the Second Amendment. Who knows for the first 200 years exactly what that meant. But since 2008, we know what it means, because we have the Supreme Court decision in District of Columbia versus Heller, where the District of Columbia tried to outlaw all handguns within the district. And the Supreme Court said a couple of interesting things. One, they said, no, there is an individual right to possess firearms based on the Second Amendment. And the second thing they said, which I think is a little more creative, because on the one hand they're being strict constitutionalists, and then the same judges decide, well, maybe we're not that strict. They said, you know, there's an argument that what that means, though, is that it pertains only to firearms that were in existence at the time, or the kinds of firearms that were in existence at the time the Constitution was passed. And they said, well, no, we don't think it means that. It means whatever kind of firearms we have today. So we wind up with this tension between regulation of firearms and the individual right to keep firearms. I saw one estimate actually in the Washington Post that said 88% out of 100 people own firearms. That's got to be high. But even Time Magazine, if you want to move a little to the left, estimates that at least 50 million Americans have firearms, and that 60% of homicides in this country are committed with firearms. So you have on the one hand lots of good gun owners, and you have on the other hand lots of offenses that are committed with firearms. And what the federal government is trying to do is thread that needle, and on the one hand regulate it to the extent that it's appropriate, and on the other hand allow those of us who like to go out and shake up old beer cans and shoot them to watch them explode be able to do that. So what I want to do is talk a little bit about how we get the federal firearms laws that we have, and it is sort of a strange and wonderful world. In the first instance, thanks to the Interstate Commerce Clause, we are able to regulate things like federal firearms licensees, and we're going to talk about them in a minute, and we're able to regulate firearms that have traveled in interstate commerce. Under the taxing authority, why didn't it move? Oh, wait a minute. Forget that. Under the taxing authority, we can impose taxes on firearms, and that's one way that we get to criminal offenses. And finally, if the federal government can have jurisdiction over a substantive criminal offense, then the fact that a firearm was used in that offense can affect the way that the offense is ultimately prosecuted. Let's talk a little about, and I will tell you, in researching this, and I went down and talked with a bunch of ATF folks about federal firearms licensees, and I learned some things that I didn't know. Under federal law, it's unlawful for anybody to deal in firearms unless they are a licensed federal dealer. Well, that's great. But what does it mean when we say they can't engage in business? And what does it mean when we say dealing in firearms? If I were you, I wouldn't waste my time trying to read all of this. Read the red part, which is sort of the nexus of it, and tell me how much information this imparts to you. Somebody who devotes their time, attention, and labor to dealing in firearms in a regular course of trade or business with a principal objective of livelihood and profit through the repetitive purchase and resale of firearms, but it doesn't include somebody who's selling a personal collection or somebody who's in it for a hobby, whatever that means. Okay, so that was really helpful. The second half of the definition deals with principal objective of livelihood and profit, and this one is just as clear as the one before it. It means that the intent underlying a firearms transaction was predominantly one of obtaining livelihood and pecuniary gain, as opposed to, for example, improving or selling off a personal firearms collection, except that you don't have to prove that if you can prove they're buying the guns for a criminal purpose or for terrorism, which are kind of two neat exceptions. Does that help anybody determine whether somebody has to be a federal firearms licensee? I can tell you it doesn't help ATF. I talked to the agent in charge of our office there in Tyler and said, okay, so how do you know when somebody has to be an FFL? He said, got me. He said, in one of his places, he said, what we would do is if we caught somebody selling guns in 3 consecutive months, we would consider prosecuting them if they weren't a federal firearms licensee. And that's the best he could come up with. And the problem is, because of our love affair with guns on the one hand and our need to regulate them on the other, Congress has given us definitions that frankly don't mean squat. Basically what we would look at if we want to prosecute an FFL is how many times they sell guns, how many guns they sell, what are the type of transactions. You know, are they selling 22 rifles or assault rifles? And whether they sell in interstate commerce. There's no question that if you have a sale across state lines, then you have to be a federal firearms licensee to do that. But an FFL can acquire and sell from firearms from a personal collection, so that he can have on this side of his store firearms that are part of his business, and on this side of the store firearms that are his personal collection. He can sell as many as he wants to, or from his personal collection, or buy as many for it as he wants to. So, you know, whether prosecuting somebody as a federal firearms licensee is not an easy task. Now, the second thing that I want to talk about with respect to interstate commerce and regulations is the background check, because it's a big deal now. Interestingly, now explain this one to me. It's operated by FBI, not by ATF. Got no idea why that is true, but FBI operates it. And the purpose is to provide more or less an instant check when somebody purchases a firearm from a federal firearms licensee. If you, young lady, are buying from the young lady next to you, background check never enters the picture. If you're buying from somebody with a personal collection at a flea market, background check never enters. In fact, I think only about 60% of firearms are sold under situations where a background check is required. Now, what happens if you go to an FFL and you say, I want to buy this gun, and you're clear on the background check? What happens to the paperwork at FBI? Anybody know? By statute, it has to be destroyed within 24 hours. So, FBI has no record other than a number that there was an inquiry that you tried to buy a gun. Now, the FFL is required to keep those records essentially forever, for at least 20 years. So there are ways to trace the firearm, but there is no repository indicating that you, unless it's denied, and we'll talk about that for just a second, indicating that you wanted to buy it. If it's denied, then there's a referral to ATF, and ATF will go out and see what the deal is and whether there was a problem with it. The two biggest things with buying from federal firearms licensee that might get prosecuted is, number one, you have to fill out a form, and if you make a false statement on the form, that can be prosecuted. Number two, it's possible that you will be prosecuted if it's a straw purchase. That is, if you're buying it really for somebody else. Although, that kind of depends on which circuit you're in, whether you're in the 5th Circuit or the 9th Circuit or the 10th Circuit, and kind of depends on what U.S. Attorney's Office you're in as to whether that will be prosecuted. But there's no specific law, actually, and this is one of the things we'll talk about when we talk about the Obama proposals. There's no specific law that prohibits a straw purchaser. There's simply a statement on the form that you fill out when you buy the gun that says, I'm buying this for myself and not for someone else. So you can be prosecuted for a false statement, but not for your stature or status as a straw purchaser. I want to talk just a moment about Fast and Furious, because it sort of enters into what the gun debate that we're in now too. Fast and Furious started out as a really neat deal in Arizona where a federal firearms licensee called ATF and said, hey, guess what? I've got these people that are buying just oodles of AK-47s for cash. And I'm kind of suspicious about that. And ATF said, well, we are too. So they started doing nothing illegal about the transactions themselves. The people who were buying them had no criminal history. They were passing the background checks. They're entitled to buy them, and they're entitled to buy as many as they want to. But ATF thought it was worth looking into, and so they looked into it. And it appeared that they were, in fact, straw purchasers, that they were buying the guns on behalf of others who were then going to ship them to Mexico. And sure enough, the guns started turning up in Mexico, and unfortunately, 2 or 3 of them were found at a shootout scene in Mexico where a DEA agent was killed. That's what got everybody's attention. Turns out there were a total of 1,961 weapons purchased from 3 federal firearms licensees in Arizona for a total of $1.4 million in cash, and only 710 of those 1,900 and something weapons were ever recovered. So what the ultimate conclusion was that, and ATF was investigating, the U.S. Attorney's Office was involved, everybody thought what we're going to do is we're going to make this a really big deal, and we're going to trace it back to the source, and we're going to get all the big wigs that are causing this. In the meantime, unfortunately, we were letting thousands of firearms go to Mexico and get used in criminal offenses. And the IG report found that ATF and the U.S. Attorney's Office had not properly supervised the operation and should never have allowed that many firearms to go unseized. Okay, that's a bunch of background stuff. Let me talk a little bit about federal firearms offenses and how we get there, and then we'll talk about where we go from here. There are a number of interstate commerce-related offenses. The one you see most often is the one that says certain kinds of people, and the Supreme Court has said this is okay. There are certain kinds of people that we can prevent from having a firearm, and the one we see most often is someone who's been convicted of a felony. But as you can see, there's a list of 9 people who under federal law can't possess firearms. Now, there is an exception to that, and this is where the strange and wonderful part comes in. For me to prosecute a felon in possession of a firearm, the firearm must have at some point in its life traveled in interstate or foreign commerce. If I've got a felon who can actually, and I don't know why there aren't more guns made in Texas. Maybe, I can't imagine why we're buying Massachusetts guns instead of having somebody make them here. But if I've got a felon who owns a firearm that was solely produced in Texas, I can't prosecute him because the firearm has to have traveled in interstate commerce, and that's how we get our federal nexus for it. Taxing authority, I love this one. Title 21, which is the Internal Revenue Code, says that there are certain kinds of firearms, basically machine guns, silencers, destructive devices, sawed-off shotguns and rifles, that you can only possess if you register them and pay the tax on them. It doesn't say you can't have them. It says you have to pay a tax on them if you want to have them. And if you have a machine gun, we don't really prosecute you for having the machine gun. We prosecute you for not bothering to register it and pay the tax on it. It's a goofy way to get there, but that's how we get there. And for us to prosecute you for that, you must know that the machine has the characteristics that require it to be registered. For example, if it's an automatic weapon, you have to know that it's an automatic weapon. If it's a sawed-off shotgun, you have to know that it's got a barrel shorter than 18 inches and an overall length of less than 26 inches or whatever it is. And then finally, the other way that you see federal firearms offenses is where we have jurisdiction over the substantive offense. And the most typical one is what we call a 924C in Title 18. It says if you commit an offense that's a crime of violence, a federal offense that's a crime of violence, or a drug trafficking crime, and you use a firearm, then we're going to tack on a minimum extra 5-year sentence to whatever you would otherwise get that you must serve consecutively. And that's the other way that we get to a firearm-related prosecution. Now, in the light of this, in the light of Fast and Furious, in the light of the various shootings that have occurred, what happens next? And there are, and you can find his proposal at whitehouse.gov, not whitehouse.com, whitehouse.gov. You can find Obama's proposal, and I actually, if anybody wants to see what these sorts of things look like, somewhere, I know I told you I wouldn't wander around, and I lied. If you want to see what executive orders look like from the president, these are a couple of his executive orders with respect to his proposals on firearms. So what are the proposals? Number one, through executive action, the president is going to encourage everybody to subject their firearms transactions to background checks. It turns out that if young lady 1 wants to sell her firearm to young lady 2, she can go to a federal firearms licensee and say, would you check out this purchaser? And federal firearms licensee has the authority to do that. It's obviously voluntary. Anybody want to guess how often that happens? About like 0. But through executive action, since he has control of federal firearms licensees, the president can encourage federal firearms licensees to encourage that happen. Another thing that he can do through executive action is encourage law enforcement at all levels and provide them with access to running the appropriate tracing and background checks before they return a firearm to an owner once it's been seized. Let's say there's a burglary, and you report a burglary with respect to near firearms, and they get seized from the pawn shop. Once ATF or FBI is through with them, you get them back. Then the proposal is to trace the firearm and run a background check before it's given back to you to make sure that in fact you're entitled to possess it. Other executive action things that Obama can do to strengthen the background check system. There are some states that say, I should have covered this in the background check thing. States, and you had your chicken, you're leaving. I would be right there with you. I'm so proud of you. Yes. I'm sorry, Lauren. He'll never come back to your.
He told me in advance he had to leave early.
Okay. That was so interesting that I forgot. Oh yeah. The background check. The information comes from local government, states, and the federal agencies and government. When if somebody's convicted of a felony, for some reason they become one of these prohibited persons, that's supposed to be reported to the background check system. A lot of states don't do that. In particular, for example, states may not report that someone has been declared mentally incompetent, which makes them a prohibited person from possessing a firearm, because they say, well, guess what? HIPAA, the Health Portability Act, the act that restricts access to medical information, they say HIPAA says that we can't do that. By executive action, the president proposes to tell states you're wrong. Here's the correct interpretation of the mental health laws, and yes, you can. He is proposing a couple of. He's proposing that the Department of Justice invest $20 million to states to give them more incentives to report this information for background checks. Interestingly, in one of the memos I passed around is to federal agencies saying, hey, you guys aren't bothering to report the information you ought to report. So I'm going to make you do a better job of reporting it. And for example, we got an email 2 weeks ago that said, hey, you U.S. attorneys' offices aren't bothering to tell us when one of your defendants has been declared too mentally incompetent to stand trial. So if you would, remember for the last 10 years, any case you've had like that, and tell us about it. And we've come up with a few, as have other U.S. attorneys, but so he's encouraging and ordering that. And most of the big federal law enforcement agencies belong to the president. DEA belongs to him, FBI belongs to him, ATF belongs to him. ICE is probably the biggest one that does not belong directly to him in Department of Justice, although it goes up through the Department of Homeland Security to him. But so there's a lot that the AG and the president can do with respect to that. And finally, he's told the AG, figure out if we need more laws. And sure enough, we got an email a couple of weeks ago, hey, y'all got any laws you want us to pass with respect to firearms? So if any of you have ideas, let me know, because we didn't have any. And I'm happy to send them up. Congressional action, universal background checks is a proposal. That when young lady 1 sells to young lady 2, she would be required to get a background check on the purchaser. But that's going to require a statute. We can guess what the odds are of that going through. Why this isn't already happening, I don't know. But through executive action, the president can require all federal agencies to trace every firearm that comes into their possession. That's not being done now. My guess is it's because it's trouble to do it. But that's one of the things that will happen because the president can make it happen. They want to ban assault rifles. That, of course, requires congressional action. A couple of bills have been submitted. A couple of bills are sitting there. We can guess what will happen. But that's obviously one of the biggies. Ban assault rifles and other limits on firearms. Limit magazines. And interestingly, I was reading that the vast majority of these mass shootings are not done with assault rifles. They're done with smaller rifles or pistols, but they tend to have really large magazines. The Gabrielle Gifford shooting, one of the victims was injured on the 33rd round. you limit a firearm to 10 rounds, a firearm magazine to 10 rounds, you're going to have a little better chance of doing something while they're reloading. And the other interesting statistic I read is that 2/3 of mass shooters are subdued by civilians, not by law enforcement. So, you limit magazines, you give those who are actually there an opportunity to do something about it. That would require congressional action. There is already a limit on armor-piercing ammunition. You're not allowed to manufacture or import it except for law enforcement purposes. But if you own some now, there's no law against you having it. And a proposal is that Congress would ban possession of currently existing armor-piercing ammunition by individuals. This is the sort of thing that you just don't think about till you start researching it. There is an exception to importation of firearms for curio or relic firearms. Well, which is fine. You want to bring in some old musket holder, okay, who cares? Problem is, curio and relic firearms are defined as anything more than 50 years old. And if you go back 50 years from today, there are some firearms with some pretty good firepower that can now be described as curio or relic firearms that aren't subject to a lot of the other restrictions that importation or sale of firearms would be. So there's a proposal that would require congressional action to redefine curio and relic firearms to recognize that. Okay, remember Strange and Wonderful? Here's a really good Strange and Wonderful one. There is apparently a statute that bans the Centers for Disease Control and other federal agencies from using their funds to advocate or promote gun control. Well, the CDC and these other agencies have interpreted that to mean, and there are others who argue that what that means is not only can you not use your funds to promote or advocate gun control, you can't use those funds to research issues surrounding gun violence. So, by executive action, the President will be instructing Centers for Disease Control and these other agencies, no, that doesn't mean you can't research causes of gun violence under that statute. So that will be a change. And in fact, he's going to direct the CDC to conduct research into the causes and prevention of gun violence using the estimate that 30,000 firearm-related homicides and suicides occur annually, at least as in 2012, that's what the number was. Remember, we talked about HIPAA. I can't tell you what it is, except it has something to do with Health Information Privacy and Portability Act. How come none of you could come up with that? My wife works at a hospital, so I hear HIPAA all the time. Remember how I told you that limits information? Well, there are arguments that means that a doctor or medical care provider can't notify law enforcement if his patient comes in and says, I'm really depressed today and I'm thinking about taking out the West Wing at my office with my 3 AK-47s and my hand grenade. By executive action, the President intends to advise healthcare providers that no, HIPAA doesn't prevent you from notifying law enforcement if there's an imminent danger that somebody's about to commit firearms violence. Same thing with respect to doctors talking to patients about mental health issues involving firearms. There will be an executive order encouraging and trying to facilitate that, and that leads to the other biggie, which is mental health issues. Any of y'all have time to read Texas Monthly? This was not a firearms case, but there was I think it was last month, there's a really good article about a kid who from about age 5 started hearing voices and seeing things, and he was a really good kid except on the days when the voices were talking to him. And he grew up and he got a girl pregnant, and I don't know whether they got married, but they actually formed a family until she got tired of the voices, and she moved out and moved in with somebody else and had a child with that somebody else. And about 2 or 3 years later, guy hears the voices and he goes up to her house and he stabs her and he stabs both the kids and kills all 3 of them. And the evidence is that from age 5 on, it was clear he needed mental health treatment, and he didn't use a firearm But the mental health issue, if you look at the numbers of people who are related to firearms violence who needed, and probably there was evidence that they needed mental health treatment, it's staggering. And so there are proposals in the President's plan, and this, of course, would require congressional action because it requires funding, but to spend additional money to make teachers and school officials aware of recognizing and reporting mental health treatments, to provide mental health treatments for students, to issue regulations, and this is executive action, to insurers and Medicaid saying, yes, you will cover mental health issues with respect to this sort of thing. And then finally, there's funding for, I don't want to be quoted on this, but this one frankly strikes me as a feel-good funding. But there's a proposal to spend more money to make schools safer, which of course would require congressional action. That's the President's plan. Will it help? I will tell you this. Prosecuting firearms violators is not going to get the job done. It's sort of like prosecuting, and I've done a lot of child porn cases, sort of like prosecuting child porn cases. I could do it from now till kingdom come, and there's still more out there. And the same thing is going to be true with firearms. Even now, we pick the most egregious firearms violators to prosecute them because there's no way to prosecute them all. And you're not going to solve bad people having guns, and you're not going to solve people having mental health issues through prosecution. So something else has to do it. You know, limits on clips, limits on kind of firearms, perhaps. Bigger background checks for everybody, perhaps. We had, I think it was over in Grand Saline, Texas, when after one of the last school shootings, they wanted to train and arm one of their janitors as their school safety officer. I don't think that will help. I'm just guessing. But I don't think that will help. I also read an interesting article about a police officer who got involved in a shootout, and he was talking about how nothing went the way he had been trained, and even he wasn't ready for it. And he says, you know, you arm people and you give them a couple of days training, and then you expect them to react in a life or death situation. And the odds are fairly good that in New York City, where the bad guy's shooting at the cops hit their target like 18% of the time, and they know what they're doing. So, and I don't mean, for crying out loud, I'm with the federal government, I can't take sides. I don't mean just any of this, but you know, none of these proposals alone are going to help. Somehow we've got to find something that will work to reduce gun violence, and at the same time let us keep shooting at our beer cans. And I don't have the answers, but that's kind of where we are. I ran over my 30 minutes. I'm available for questions. If anybody has questions or want to shoot the bull or whatever. Otherwise, I'd suggest you start your holiday. Yes, ma'am.
How do you think the media plays into this whole gun situation, or do you have sort of specific direction that the federal government can take in terms of what the media does with guns? Because personally, I feel like the media makes a really big difference in this issue. And for instance, I'm from Colorado, and Eric can go in our household names, but I can't name one person who died in a combat shooting. And I think that's really interesting. And I think that something about that has to be fixed and addressed, along with all of the things specifically about guns. I'm curious about that.
The question is, how does the media play into this? And frankly, your opinion is as good as mine. My own impression is that, and I want to use the word glorify, by publicizing it, the media encourages more of it. On the other hand, I can't imagine them not publicizing it because I want to know what's going on. I don't know what the answer is there. And frankly, the story of the two shooters in Colorado is put this in quotes, a more interesting story in most cases than that of the victims. So I don't know what the answer is to that. And of course, the other thing is that little constitutional amendment with respect to the press, and I feel at least as strongly about the government restricting the press as I do them firearms. So I don't know what the answer is. Well, I do. There's not a good answer. There's just not. That's part of living in a democracy that gets extremely messy, and it just does. Yes, sir.
Do you know anything about these reports that DHS is buying up gobs of rounds and why that might be?
No. In fact, I don't know that I've heard that. I would.
I don't know if it's true. I'm just curious. Saying that they're buying up. That the ammunition shortage is because DHS is buying millions of rounds and stockpiling.
I would.
If it's true or if that's somebody.
Okay, we're among friends here, right?
And you're also being recorded. You're also being recorded.
I know, but don't we have non-attribution policy in law school? My own personal opinion, I would be surprised for a couple of reasons. Number one, DHS is one of the most politicized federal agencies we have. And there's some wonderful people in DHS and some wonderful agents, but in a lot of ways it is highly dysfunctional. Simply because so much of what it deals with is so political. Number two, that would require a lot of forward thinking and budgeting on the part of a lot of people, and I can tell you that the likelihood of a vast government conspiracy, from what I know, both from the Air Force and the federal government, is highly unlikely, because they just don't work that well. And the third thing is they're about to be furloughing people and sending them home because of the sequestration. So my guess is they are desperate enough for money. It's not happening, but I mean, it could. My impression is from, at least in East Texas, there's an ammo shortage because lots of people want ammo, is my own personal impression. But I don't know. Yes, sir.
Do you have any comments about the fact that there are hundreds of sheriffs across the country who have said that they won't enforce the gun legislation?
The question was, do I have any comments about the hundreds of sheriffs, including the one in Smith County where Tyler is, who says they won't enforce, and I was reading today, I think it was Duluth, Minnesota, passed a law that said no federal firearms offense is going to be enforced in the confines of Duluth, Minnesota. And my first reaction was, okay, my guess is nobody cares in Duluth, Minnesota, but I can, yes, I want to put this politely because we just elected a new sheriff. And I really like him. He is a former ATF agent who somewhere lost his marbles. And I can tell you, in Smith County, you want to get elected, A, you're going to run as a Republican, and B, you're going to get the Tea Party, no tax folks behind you. It's the only way you're going to get elected. And that's what Larry did. And Larry came out with all this. You're not going to do this, and you're not going to do that in my county. Most of it, frankly, is bluster. A, they can't prevent it. They can decide not to cooperate, but I don't think most of them will, because in the end, most of what the federal government does is good, and most of it is helpful to the community. So my own personal opinion is it's mostly bluster, and it's part of what you do to get elected. If I ever meet our current sheriff on a dark alley, we're going to have a serious discussion about it. I will lose, but I will have tried to keep him from dissing the federal government. But I mean, there's, they can't stop it, frankly. They just can't. We've got too many agents and too many firearms. Yes, sir.
Good. Oh, have you heard about people like 3D printing firearms? That's a thing.
You mean like I've heard about the new 3D printers. Is that what you're talking about?
There's a guy down in Austin who's 3D printing lowers for M16s. The only part that's controlled. Well, you think, how would it go down, you think, if someone tried to, could he get prosecuted if he sold that 3D printer, digital copy across state lines? Do you think that would count as?
Is this something that actually operates?
Oh, yeah.
Well, yeah, but I think when they fire, I mean, I think they're not, since it's all polymer, I don't think they actually would
No, yeah.
Oh, you're not talking about printing it out of paper. It prints it out of...
No, like plastic.
Really?
That completely prints lower out of polymer book.
I have no idea. Let me rephrase that. There is somebody somewhere who will prosecute for that. My immediate reaction is I'm not sure I'd want to spend my time on it, but unless it actually, I mean, if it's operational, it works the way it's supposed to work, then yeah, we'd probably go after it.
Is selling just the digital information that someone would make the physical object in a different state, would that count as selling a firearm?
My guess is no, under the way the statute's written now. That's a guess, knowing very little about what you're suggesting. But it, and you mean, for example, I don't think, I know we never prosecuted before, I don't think there are laws that say I can't post on the internet how to make a bomb. But we'll prosecute somebody if they do it. Yeah. So my guess is just providing digital information is probably not, at least the way the laws are written right now. I mean, there might be some other way we could get them through a fraud statute or something. And I love the interstate commerce clause. It's amazing what we can prosecute just using it. But I'd be surprised if the prosecute as a firearms violation. Yes, sir.
Bouncing off of Marcy's question, I don't think there are many more hot button issues right now where these really heavy statistics get thrown around as a firm basis for whatever we're doing. And so with regard to that 30,000 people that were killed or died in firearm-related homicides last year.
Or suicides. That was both. It was like 19,000 homicides, 11,000 suicides.
That was going to be my question is, do we have, talking about the CDC being limited on this kind of research, do we have firm breakdowns of like suicides, murders, criminal versus criminal crimes, accidents, so on and so forth? Do we have reliable numbers with that? And how heavily does that kind of information play into these next steps?
To answer the last question first, the numbers play heavily because they get bandied about a lot. And as I said, some of them, like the 88 out of 100 Americans owning a gun, it was an unreliable source, but boy, I find that hard to believe. And it's not right if Time Magazine is right that only 50 million Americans own guns. There are, I'm going to have to guess, but my impression is from the statistics I have seen collected, there are fairly reliable collectors of statistics, which is different from what he's proposing that the CDC do, which is not just keep the statistics, but get into the why are these happening, you know. The FBI has got all sorts of crime statistics in general and firearm-related statistics. And my guess is they're within a margin of error of being accurate, but that's a guess.
The reason I ask is that if you said 19,000 homicides and the balance were suicides, if 19,000 innocent school children were killed last year because of privately sold firearms, then that's a huge problem. But if it was 18,500 criminal on criminal type homicides, that kind of changes, I think, possibly the steps we should take.
And in fact, I forgot this statistic to share this, but one of the reasons that I call the school funding measure sort of a feel-good deal, the statistic is that 1 in 3 million children will be killed at school. 1 in 1 million adults will be struck by lightning. So, you know, except for the fact that they're kids, and it's a really bad thing for kids to get shot and killed, the numbers I mean, there are a whole lot of other ways you're more likely to get killed, and a kid is more likely to get killed than a shooting at school. But I hasten to add, as with everybody else, but one is one too many, and it is, you know. But it's an easy one to get people riled up over. My guess is there are statistics that indicate that at least try to track how many of them are criminal on criminal, how many of them are muggings, how many of them are robberies, and that sort of thing. I don't know what they are, but I'll bet they're out there. Yes, sir.
Where do you see the debate going in the next couple of years? Do you think a lot of the stuff's going to be passed, or what's your prediction for this bill?
The stuff that President Obama can do by executive action will happen. The stuff that requires congressional action, other than increasing some funding for some things, will not happen. I'd be surprised, given where we are right now, if Congress did anything significant with respect to limiting kinds of guns and magazines and that sort of thing. I can see them passing some money to fund things like school safety. I didn't mention this one, but there's a proposal for more money to keep cops on the street. I can see them passing that sort of thing. Those are less controversial, and frankly, they make you look very law and order. And there's evidence it helps. Back when we went to the COPS grants, which are were DOJ grants to put more cops on the street locally. I mean, there's evidence that it helps, and I think it does. You have cops in the neighborhood, you're less likely to have crime in the neighborhood. We've done a deal like that down in Port Arthur, which was having all sorts of street crime issues, violent crime, and we made a concerted effort to start. Every time there was a firearm offense, we prosecuted. And sure enough, Port Arthur violent crime numbers are down. But I think that sort of thing will go. I can't imagine that we'll get anywhere on the fights about. Frankly, what I think will make a difference more than anything, to use an example of gay marriage, which, almost on a dime, the numbers are changing in terms of who supports it and who doesn't. I think the same thing will sort of happen with firearms as your generation gets older. Every generation is a little more removed from those of us who grew up out in the middle of nowhere, and everybody had a gun, and every pickup had a gun rack, and there was a rifle in it. And as the country becomes more and more urban, this idea that we got to have a firearm for a militia isn't going to mean as much to more people. And that's the sort of thing that will sort of change. That's my guess. I don't know whether that's good or bad. There were advantages to, going snake hunting with a gun. But a lot of kids now, I talked to one of our lawyers in Plano, who's the attorney in charge over there. He has handled a firearm once in his life. And he's probably in the early 40s, handled a firearm once in his life, and that was when one federal agent handed it to him to hand to another federal agent. And that's the only time he's ever touched a weapon. And if more people are like that, then this gut reaction about leave my guns alone is not going to be the same. It's just not. Oh, yes, ma'am.
One of my close friends, we went shooting the other day, and he said, if they limit my magazines, that's just going to make me angry because I can change a clip in 3 seconds. So do you think that would really be effective to limit the number of bullets or whatever that capacity is?
Okay.
So he can change clips really quickly. So if someone in a shooting, do you think that would actually slow them down if they had to change clips?
Reminding everybody that my 2 rifles are a single shot 22 and a 20 gauge shotgun that will hold 3 shells. So I'm not the expert, but I can. But based on some of the reading and all I've done, the answer is quite possibly.
He's
because
also a staff or a sergeant in the Army, so he might be a little faster.
Well, and from what I was reading about reactions in situations like this, it's one thing, to be out hunting and changing the clip. It's another thing, frankly, and my guess is, like the kids in Colorado, that they're under a completely different mental attitude at that point. And it's one thing to do it under conditions of no stress. It's another thing to do it under conditions of serious stress. And I would make the argument 3 seconds is 3 seconds. So it seems to me, as a non-expert, that yes, something like limiting number of rounds in a clip or a magazine could make a difference. Particularly if the statistic is correct that 2/3 of them are disarmed by civilians. Because you give me, if I'm fairly close and I've got 3 seconds to start throwing things at him or run at him or something, then maybe.
I don't know if it's just a comment about the magazines. The other side to it is, one, you're limiting the defense capability of someone who's carrying. And then also, I mean, how do you pick a number? It's kind of arbitrary to just say you can have so many rounds.
Well, you're right. And I mean, again, you sort of point up the whole problem with the firearms debate. Firearms are great for sport and for self-defense. Not so great when somebody goes out and shoots somebody with them. And I don't know enough about firearms to know how you pick what's a reasonable number. One of the statistics I read, I think said you could fire off, and you keep nodding, so you may know more about firearms than I do. If I'm wrong, tell me. But I think it said you could shoot off about 40 to 50 rounds a minute with a semi-automatic rifle. And I would argue nobody needs, even if you haven't done something in 40 or 50 rounds in frankly, if you haven't done something in 10 rounds, probably in self-defense, you're probably SOL. That would be my guess from what I've read about how people respond to these situations. And apparently a lot of people just freeze when they think they can respond, and they just don't. I'm pretty convinced I would be one of those. That I'd say, look, okay, my time's up. I'd really like to pull my gun out and shoot you, but I just can't make my hand move. But I don't know. I don't know what's appropriate. There are, I assume, people who can tell you this is sort of a good dividing line between needing to be able to shoot off so many rounds, and once you get past that, whatever you're shooting at would be gone if you're using it for sport. But I don't know. Yes, sir.
With regards to the magazine limit debate, one argument I saw for the other side of the coin is that the Virginia Tech shooting, which is today the most horrific example of a campus shooting, the shooter did all of it with 10, 14 round handgun magazines and got 140 rounds in some excellent movements.
My guess is if you know what you're doing, you can do it very quickly, particularly if there's nobody in a position to challenge you. And of course, the other argument with respect to limiting rounds is if, in fact, the reason we have the Second Amendment is to keep some future federal government who is misbehaving at bay, I can tell you the folks in the Army and the Air Force aren't limited to magazines with 10 rounds. And if you limit those of us who are prepared to defend against them to 10 rounds, then you just created a serious disadvantage. And it's a Second Amendment argument. And heck, I don't know, we could pass a law limiting clips and it not withstand Supreme Court. I don't know.
But on that same vein, they also have tanks and lots of other things, drones and things that private citizens don't have. So, okay.
Yeah, you can, but I'm assuming it has to, because we got a lawyer in Tyler who has one. Do you have one? But I'm assuming you probably have to disarm them. I mean, do whatever.
You can unload if you want to, it wouldn't take long. You got to get the bullets to it, that's the hard part. That's what the problem's going to be, is if they're limiting bullets, because they can't do nothing in the Second Amendment about that.
Do they not track sale of that kind of ammunition?
Nope. And frankly, that came as a shock to me, to find that there's no central repository for background checks and that sort of thing. I mean, if ATF finds a weapon at a crime scene, they can find they can find where it was manufactured, or if it was imported, where it was imported to. They can trace it down to the dealer and the first sale. But after that, unless it goes back through an FFL where there is another record of the sale of it, then that's it. You don't know. And you'd be, well, I can tell you, most of the firearms that we deal with, we have no idea where they've been. We just know this particular person wound up with them. And the argument is, you let the federal government have their central repository, it's a whole lot easier for them to come get our guns. Which is, assuming the federal government that at some point decides it wants to do that, it's a really valid argument. You make it a whole lot harder for them to come get them if they don't know where they are. Now, whether in this day and time it's still a good argument to make, Congress and the public's going to have to decide. But that's the argument. That's why there is no central repository. And I just assumed there was when I came to work here. Okay, I kept y'all late. I'm sorry, but thank you very much. Again, thanks for having me. It was a pleasure.